As a psychologist, over the years I've found that the issue of aloneness, especially as we age, often becomes a prominent and challenging theme. Because of the prevalence and stickiness of this issue, I'd like to offer my reflections on aloneness and to try and expand the different ways that it could manifest. But first, I'd like to start with a quote. "When we are alone and quiet, we are afraid that something will be whispered in our ear, and so we hate the silence and drug ourselves with social life." The philosopher Nietzsche expressed this thought over 100 years ago, and yet its words still ring true today. Our society is seemingly gripped by a powerful fear of the experience of being alone, and the inevitable, or so it is thought, consequences of unhappiness, of failure, depression, and anxiety. The focus of much of our socialization is to learn skills that will allow us to not be alone, to be able to be part of a union with parents, siblings, significant others, colleagues, religious groups, social organizations, even the larger community. Seemingly, any union is seen as the antidote to this malaise of being alone. At midlife, however, many of these relationships come apart through divorce, children leaving home, unexpected changes in career, etc. Our aging years further amplifies the chances of spending time alone. The increased likelihood of losing a partner, experiencing decreased health, including diminished mobility, loss of available social connections, and decreased independence all factor into the increased likelihood of time spent alone. It is important to note, however, that these concerns and fears identified by Nietzsche are based on the following edict, and that edict is, to be alone is to be lonely. To be alone is to be lonely. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Alone is always equal to being lonely. The 17th century philosopher Pascal observed that the court jester was invented to divert the king from being alone, for this would surely cause loneliness, which would lead to the king becoming anxious and vexed. So, Pascal argued, all of modern culture was a vast diversion or distraction to keep us from being alone, and, concomitantly, from experiencing loneliness. It's an impossible task, and yet hundreds of years later, our culture is still valiantly trying to shield us from this demon called loneliness. However, it's important to recognize that loneliness is a reality for many people, and surveys certainly indicate that it does come with a higher incidence of health concerns, especially mental health ones. The issue, though, is the false assumption that being alone always leads to loneliness. Always. This faulty belief demonizes the human experience of separation and being alone, existential conditions that we cannot avoid. An early humanistic psychologist, Dr. Clark Moustakis, extensively studied this phenomenon of aloneness. He writes, "I believe that it is necessary for every person to recognize his loneliness, to become intensely aware that ultimately, in every fiber of his being, man is alone, terribly, utterly alone. Efforts to overcome or escape the existential experience of loneliness can result only in self-alienation. When man is removed from a fundamental truth of life, when he successfully evades and denies the terrible loneliness of individual existence, he shuts himself off from one significant avenue of his own self-growth." Well, not exactly the happiest of thoughts, Dr. Moustakis, but an encounter with our aloneness is one that we each must face to varying degrees and at different points in our lives. To not deny or run from this existential experience provides us with an opportunity to alter our focus from, how can I escape this loneliness, to a different focus, one that says, how can I understand and create a different relationship with my solitude? A major shift in our thinking from aloneness equals loneliness to aloneness equals solitude. The theologian Paul Tillich wrote, "The wisdom of our language has sensed two sides of man's being alone. It has created the word loneliness in order to emphasize the pain of being alone. And it has created the word solitude in order to emphasize the glory of being alone. In daily life, these two words are not always distinguished, but we should do so consistently, thus deepening the understanding of our human predicament. The modern poet David Whyte echoes the contradictions contained within the single word alone. He writes, "Being alone is a difficult discipline. A beautiful and difficult sense of being solitary is always the ground from which we step into a contemplative intimacy with the unknown. But the first portal of aloneness is often experienced as a gateway to alienation, grief, and abandonment." Meeting solitude. To move from experiencing aloneness as loneliness to solitude is not an easy task. The cultural learning of what this should feel like is very powerful. However, there have been a number of writers who have attempted to face this concern and provide roadmaps to help us experience these stations of solitude, as they are called, along our life's journey. One of the most popular early writers was Henry David Thoreau, whose reflections are recorded in his book Walden. His 2 years alone at Walden Pond led him to discover an aspect of himself that was not readily apparent when he was caught up in his busy outer life. He wrote, "Society is commonly too cheap. Society is commonly too cheap. We meet at very short intervals, not having had time to acquire any new value for each other. We meet at meals 3 times a day and give each other a new taste of that old musty cheese that we are. We have had to agree on a certain set of rules, called etiquette and politeness, to make this frequent meeting tolerable, and that we need not come to open war. We meet at the post office, and at the sociable, and about the fireside every night. We live thick and are in each other's way, and stumble over one another. And I think that we lose some respect for one another. Certainly less frequency would suffice for an all-important communications." For Thoreau, living in nature allowed him to discover that experiencing the world around him through his senses was one of the major benefits of solitude. He advocated the pursuit of individual meaning by concentrating on this experience of actively and consciously living in the here and now. He writes, "I wish so to live ever as to derive my satisfactions and inspirations from the commonest events, everyday phenomena, so that what my senses hourly perceive, my daily walk, the conversation of my neighbors, may inspire me, and I may dream of no heaven but that which lies about me." Thoreau had chosen to cultivate an attitude of contemplation and reverence for the quiet world around him. His relationship to his aloneness was therefore born of a sense of gratitude and awe for the silence and solitude that he experienced. Dr. Clark Moustakis also highlights the role of silence in our experience of solitude. He writes, "Solitude is an organic form of relationship with nature. We speak without voice to the trees and the clouds and the waves of the sea, or we listen to poetry, or read it, or listen to music, or view works of art. Silence is an essential part of solitude. In silence there is a self-conscious, careful perceiving within, unlike any other reality, deep and pervasive, leaving its own distinctive mark. The real silence surrounds us on every side and is the source of the undercurrents of life." Moving from loneliness to solitude. The Jungian psychologist, Dr. James Hollis, believes that in order to move from an experience of loneliness to that of solitude, you must change your beliefs and expectations from what our culture has taught us. Specifically, he notes that changes must occur in the following 3 areas. The first area is what he calls absorbing the trauma of separation. Absorbing the trauma of separation. Now, Hollis notes that it is difficult to fully appreciate either the trauma of birth or the full effects of the parent-child relationship. The more beneficent that early parent-child relationship, the more you will be self-sufficient and comfortable with solitude. Paradoxically, the more troubled the relationship to the parent, the more dependent you will later be on relationships in general. This therefore makes it much more difficult to positively experience moments of aloneness. That is, to experience aloneness as other than abandonment or loneliness. In order to move more within the experience of solitude, Hollis suggests that we must consciously ask each day, in what way am I so afraid that I am avoiding myself, my own journey? In what way am I so afraid that I am avoiding myself, my own journey? The ability to understand and define ourselves from our inner reality rather than through an outer context, such as relationships or career, accomplishments, status, etc., allows us to operate out of a sense of personal integrity and solitude. And this, in turn, allows for our openness to the experience of solitude. The second area that Hollis identified is one that I had touched upon in an earlier podcast on non-judgment, and that is the withdrawal of projections. Hollis specifically notes the need to withdraw projections in regard to losses. He specifically talks about losses of those that we love that often occur at midlife and in later years. Children move away, divorce devastates, partners, family members, friends pass away. This can often lead to not only pain and anguish, but also a loss of identity. Hollis concludes that we need to see how much of our lives are being caught up in the projections of meaning and identity onto others, whether it be a spouse, a child, a friend, work, or persona. When we can withdraw these projections, we can experience a psychic expanse, a spaciousness within ourselves that allows for an opening to and understanding of our aloneness and solitude. The third area that requires attention in order to experience aloneness as solitude is what Hollis calls ritualizing fear. Ritualizing fear. Hollis notes that people so fear loneliness that they will cling to terrible relationships and constricting professions rather than seek the letting go of the other. Remember that something that Nietzsche suggested we feared hearing? Well, it in fact may be useful and liberating, but we will never hear that inner voice unless we risk loneliness. In the end, Hollis notes, there is no substitute for the courage necessary to confront loneliness. He concludes, the goal is to still the traffic of the mind, the neurotic clutter that floods and distracts. If we are afraid of being alone, afraid of silence, then we can never really be present to ourselves. Self-alienation is very much the condition of the modern world, and it can only be changed by individual action. Hollis recommends devising a daily ritual of private meaning to help us to experience this alone time in a more positive way. For example, this daily period could involve sitting quietly, with no phone or TV or anything else to distract yourself, and to just listen. Just listen to the silence. While this can at first feel very strained and artificial, it does allow for the silence to speak and the opportunity for us to hear it. The silence to speak is a lovely characterization of the gift held within solitude. Mindfulness meets aloneness. Another avenue open to experience aloneness as solitude and not loneliness is that of mindfulness meditation. It is certainly not a new opening, as mindfulness originated more than 2,600 years ago, but it is designed to offer a welcoming opportunity to meet the experience of solitude, of simply being with yourself. Mindfulness meditation is a practice that involves 4 components, including paying attention, on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally. This deceptively easy practice involves 2 aspects which are particularly beneficial to learning to be alone with yourself. The first benefit is the self-regulation of attention towards the present moment. Specifically, not being absorbed in the past or the future, which is where your mind usually takes you when left alone. Mindfulness is a practice that allows you to consciously bring more attention towards just this present moment. It specifically trains your mind to not get caught in chasing thoughts or feelings or physical sensations that pull you away from experiencing just this present moment. The second beneficial aspect of mindfulness is that it involves a different orientation or relationship to this present moment. And it is this specific aspect that I believe is critical in establishing a different relationship with our aloneness, and whether it is experienced as a loneliness or solitude. A central feature of mindfulness is that through experiential learning, you come to understand that the mind not only is focused on the past or the future, but it is also constantly making judgments about each thought, emotion, or sensation. In addition, the mind erroneously believes that it not only knows what will come next, but that it can also control life's experiences. Through understanding and incorporating the attitudinal foundations that I have been emphasizing in these podcasts, those being non-judgment, non-striving, acceptance, beginner's mind, patience, trust, and letting go, they allow you to develop a different relationship with your life. Mindfulness presents an opportunity to establish a way of life that gives you confidence to face whatever arises. Through mindfulness practice, you develop not only a belief, but more importantly, a knowing through experience that you can meet whatever life presents, including the experience of being alone. This doesn't mean that life is painless. Well, because no life is, but you can hold a more confident attitude that provides more ease to navigate through each day. Mindfulness allows you to become a better friend to yourself, which also includes taking the sting out of your existential experience of aloneness. Personal growth through aloneness. Not only can you find joy and strength in solitude, but it can also provide a path towards continued personal growth. The contribution that solitude can make to our continued personal growth is summarized by Clark Moustakis. He writes, "In real solitude we are expansive, limitless, free. We do not disguise our feelings from ourselves, but rather we renew contact with ourselves and discover who we are. At other times we are pulled into the collective stream that surrounds us. We experience the collective sense that we have incorporated in order to achieve recognition, security, and comfort. But in solitude, one breaks through the dead, static patterns and has an opportunity to see life as it really is, and to become aware of a desire for new meaning, excitement, and vitality, of a desire to be whole and to live more fully and completely." For most of us, life is not an endless expanse of aloneness. Our participation in family, career, religion, and community consumes large portions of our time and resources. But within our outer world commitments, there are nevertheless what have been called stations of solitude along the journey of our life. These stations seem to be particularly noticeable during the midlife and later aging years, as changes in our outer world circumstances inevitably occur. This not only provides an opportunity to experience our relationship with aloneness in a more positive, solitude manner, but it also provides for growth and change in our other outer world relationships. It has both advantages. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung notes, "Loneliness is not necessarily injurious to companionship, for no one is more sensitive to companionship than the lonely man. And companionship thrives only when each individual remembers his or her individuality and does not identify himself or herself with others." Through the process of experiencing one's separateness and solitude, you can feel an increased appreciation for the interpersonal connections that the other aspects of your life presents. A deeper appreciation of the other is felt when one has experienced the vitality and security that comes from experiencing solitude. A simple example of this process occurred during the latter part of a meditation retreat that I participated in many years ago. High in the mountains of New Mexico, over 200 individuals gathered for 10 days of silent meditation and introspection. As is typical with such retreats, not only was talking not allowed, but each was encouraged to avoid eye or physical contact with other participants during the days and nights that were spent in a practice of mindfulness. The setting and structure of the retreat definitely engendered a strong sense of aloneness. One evening, a cold wind gathered strength and began to blow through the meditation hall. As I returned to my cushion for the final sit of the night, I found that my friend had left his prayer shawl for me to keep warm. At that simple act of thoughtfulness and caring, I sat down and wept. I wept in appreciation not only for his kindness, but also for the friendship and deep connection that we shared. My awareness of all the close relationships that I had experienced during my life, and those that I was still fortunate to be involved with, were reviewed during the remaining days of the retreat. And through these reflections, I was filled with gratitude for my aloneness, my solitude in the midst of my aloneness, as well as my companionship with others. I'd like to end with a passage from a poem by William Wordsworth called The Prelude. He writes, "When from our better selves we have too long been parted by the hurrying world, and droop, sick of its business, of its pleasures tired, how gracious, how benign is solitude."